Hi guys, I promised you an overview of the first session that was postponed today, and here goes. I'm going to do it in two parts. I'm just going to give you an overview of what we've done so far and what's coming up in this semester, and then I'll do a separate one which looks specifically at the assessment. So, apologies for today, and hopefully I can cover most of the things that I was going to talk about today in this little short online video. So the workshop today was supposed to be around drug use so far, so a bit of a reflection on what we've done, how what we've done can help you with your assessment, and looking forward to what we're going to be doing for semester 2. And I think the most important thing to remember is that everything that we do on this module can be linked to your second assessment task, and it's up to you to start thinking about that now and what you're going to be doing it on. There's a nice little quote there: drugs, 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 which are good, which are bad. We're definitely going to be thinking about this concept this semester. Is there a distinction between some which are good and some which are bad? How do we define that? What kind of terms would we use? What kind of definitions would we use? And we're going to be giving you loads of examples that you can focus on if you want to take a specific angle, policy, theory, type of drug, and we'll talk about a little bit more when we look at the assessment. So, if we think about today's session, I'll just reiterate what we did in semester 1. I won't go over it in too much detail. You are all there, hopefully. Talk a little bit about the semester 2 and specifically the semester 2 assessment. So what did we do in semester 1? Well, predominantly it was historical, and we took you right back to the Victorian era all the way through to the 1990s, and we looked at this in a chronological fashion and highlighted some of the main points of drug use, drug patterns, and more importantly the underpinning elements of social change that helped us to explain why people took drugs at that specific point in time. There was also a theme around policy, developments in international policy, pressure from overseas, how we developed our own domestic drug policy in line with what was happening elsewhere. And we started thinking quite critically about policy. We started to give some examples of different types of use and different types of drugs. And we finished off thinking about moving into a more contemporary era, so needing a more contemporary type of theorising. And this type of information, some of it will have helped you with your semester 1 assessment, but also it can help you with semester 2, particularly around contextualising how things have changed. So if you want to look at a specific topic, what did we used to do then and what do we do now? And rather that being a descriptive element, I don't want you to just describe what we did in the 1930s. I want you to use some of the examples from the 1930s to show how that's different, how we've progressed, or maybe we haven't progressed in terms of policy and use since that time. So some of the overarching themes and the things that we would expect you to be drawing out of the first semester are as follows. We really did hammer home to you, and James also talked to you about some of the theoretical underpinnings around liberalism, which were based in social, political and economic change. And we tried to stress to you that you have to look at drug use in context of what was happening socially, politically, economically, the climate at that time, what was happening politically, the kind of social changes, what was unemployment rates like, what was the social conditions, and they help to explain changes and patterns in drug use. And what we did is we talked to you about different types of drugs and different examples of subcultures, for example, that have changed throughout time, and you can really do case these in social, political, economic change. And that is one of the learning outcomes for this module, and it's absolutely essential that you make reference to notions of social, economic, political change in your assessments. One of the other themes we looked at was this phenomenon of othering. So maybe you think about it as stigma, maybe you think about it as a race issue. We talked about that when we thought about the 1920s, 1930s, and the kind of opium dens, when we thought about the opium wars, when we thought about the young white female, and the as then was termed Oriental, not a term we'd use today, but was back then. And we will continue this theme of othering all the way through into contemporary notions of stigma. If we think about types of language, the addict, the junkie, it's about exclusion. It's about separating people who use drugs from the norm, from the others, so the included, the excluded. And we specifically talk about Jock Young in particular in this notion of othering. And you can see examples of that all the way through history, and you will also see it in the contemporary era. We talked about the rise of prohibition, not just prohibition of alcohol, but prohibition of drugs in general. And this came from the kind of normalised notion of everybody did it in the Victorians. And it gradually started to creep towards what we had in the 1970s, Richard Nixon's phrase, the war on drugs. So what we've seen over this kind of period of history is an increase in policy which has prohibited the use of substances. But remember, only some substances. What we've also seen is the development of subcultures. Excuse me. The development of subcultures, and we've given you some examples. Northern Soul, we've talked about the hippies as a subculture. Go back to your Crim Theory at level 5, find out what a subculture is all about. Is this something that you want to develop further in terms of your assessments? We also critiqued whether ecstasy use was a subculture. It became so widespread. Does that really underpin the notion of what a subculture is? So if you wanted to think theoretically, again, another key point that we need to have mentioned in your assessment, it's part of our learning outcomes that we look at theory, this might be one way of doing it. Moral panics has been a very prevalent theme all the way through history, and again we'll see that in the contemporary era as well. We talked about Billy Carlton, we talked about Leah Betts. There are other examples from the contemporary era around legal highs, we'll talk about that. So all the way through from the Victorians to the 90s, we saw examples of moral panic. Again, theoretically, what does that term mean? Who do we cite it to? So who came up with it? And how can we apply it to drug use? What does it help us to understand? We talked about changes in types of drug, opium. We started with the botany, if you remember, and then I said it became a little bit more about chemistry because we started making things, and then it was all about psychology. We wanted some more, so we made them stronger, we made them different. Again, you'll see that in the contemporary era. Drugs have changed, and we've moved away from essentially the more natural products into the kind of synthetic, which we're seeing today. But we've seen and we can track that change over time. We've also seen a change in type of user. Pre-Victorians, everybody did it. It was in your baby's cough mixture. We moved to large-scale subcultures, and then maybe we've got examples of small-scale subcultures as well, if you think about Northern Soul. Types of use. Think about the key terms that we've referred you to on this module. Normalised use, and we will come back to this again, the theory of normalisation, part of semester 2. Recreational use came up very much with the ecstasy use. Problematic use, we saw use that term when we were thinking about heroin use in the 1980s. These are key terms that describe type of use, not necessarily type of user, but type of use. And you again, if you're going to use these terms, define them, understand what they mean. We have tracked changes in supply. Remember, we were quite critical of the medical profession. They did a lot to protect their own interests, the elite, the addicted elite as it was. When we had the British system, when they couldn't cope with the rise in addicts, they decided they didn't want to have responsibility for prescription anymore, and we had the birth of the kind of the black or the underground market. And we can be quite critical of that in terms of the changes in our supply. We've commented on lots of theory, whether that's liberalism, social change, notions of identity, and also changes in policy. Again, 2 key dimensions, learning outcomes for this module. Can you talk theoretically about drug use, and can you think about changes in policy? And again, we have seen changes in policy and we've tracked them throughout semester 1. We've covered an awful lot, and they're key themes, some of which you may be interested in and thinking about, how can I take these forward for my assessment? What am I particularly interested in? And you need to make sure that you've got some historical content and some contemporary content in your assessment. So it's absolutely essential that you start reflecting on the kind of content that we covered. Okay, so what's up and coming then? We will talk more about theory, but contemporary theory. So that's issues around late modernity, the risk society. Some of the sociologists among you will have come across these before. We won't assume that. We'll go through them in detail for you. We may talk about edge work, which is this kind of recreational use for excitement, pushing yourself to the edge. We will talk about normalization, Howard Parker. Some people call it a theory, some people call it a normalization thesis. Does it explain, or does it just map out how use has changed? But we'll go into that in detail. We'll also talk about alternatives to prohibition. We've seen a rise in prohibition of substances. What else could we do? We could decriminalise, we could regulate, we could do a whole number of things which have a political underpinning, and it might be something we want to look into. The NPS, novel psychoactive substances, or legal highs, is a big media frenzy at the minute around what's going on with these, research into them, what are they, who's taking them, what are the problems, and we will look at these in particular and some of the new reports which have come out. We'll also focus on unusual users. We might have a couple of guest lectures coming in talking about different types of use that may be a bit outside of our awareness. Drugs in sport, older users, so use doesn't just stop at age 40. We might look at older users, and we'll also look globally. So what's happening around the world? Is the UK different? Are we the same? What can we learn from others in terms of our problems with drug use and our reactions to it in policy? So that's pretty much what we've done and pretty much what we're going to be doing in semester 2. I hope you're all going to stick with us. Thanks.